Man, there's nothing better than sitting down with a good book. Hey everybody, welcome to the GMG review. I am today checking out Aftermath. And this is the first time I'm going to have done a review of a piece of fiction on this channel. So I'm actually really excited about this. This is my first GMG review for something that isn't like a rule book. And God, do I want to do this more often. This was kindly sent along as a complimentary review copy by Corvus Belli. And this is the third in their series of graphic novels slash mangas, which outline sort of, I would say, like the soft white underbelly of the Infinity Universe. It is written, in this case, by Victor Santos and Pedro Andreu. And Victor Santos, for those of you who don't know him, is actually a pretty heavy hitter in the comic book world in Spain. And this is a bit like, I would say from a miniature wargaming company point of view, this is a bit like the early Dan Abnett novels, where you've got someone who is quite talented writing for your game company. And I think they're very lucky to have him. So what did I do? Well, I decided to go back and read my other two graphic novels before I started reviewing this book, because I felt like it was going to be really important to explain to you guys sort of why I like this series of comic books and how they rank against each other, because I'm gonna do a proper review. And I guess to try and figure out what my structure was gonna be for doing stuff like this in the future, because I hadn't really done it before. So that being said, some caveats. If you haven't read these, there's gonna be some spoilers, especially of the first two, but if you're interested in Infinity and the lore, then you've been warned. I'm gonna spoil some stuff. And the reason I'm gonna spoil some stuff is it's important to the structure of the review and explaining the structure of why I like these books in general. Two, if you're not familiar with certain concepts in the Infinity Universe, this is probably gonna sound like gobbledygook. So I'm gonna do my best to couch my language as if people don't necessarily have a ton of universe knowledge in this universe. And I think that's gonna be important for the structure, but there may be some terms you just don't understand. Good news is the Infinity Wiki has tons of this on here, or tons of the knowledge that you might need. And you can just go to Corvus Belli's website and probably look up most of the history of the human sphere that I'm talking about. So, 3 books. And why did I want to talk about all 3 as opposed to just talking about Aftermath in a vacuum? Well, I think what's great about science fiction literature when it really works is most science fiction literature is about proposing an existential question and trying to answer what that might mean in the future when we have even more technology or even more access to doing things that previously would have been considered magic. And the Infinity Universe is littered with those kinds of questions because technology has advanced to the point where, of course, we can copy human consciousness. Everyone has what's called a cube. If you've watched TV shows or read the books for Altered Carbon, it's referred to as a stack. Greg Egan writes in the 90s about these things and calls it a cookie, where you don't know if this thing is you or not, basically. And it's effectively allowed humanity to achieve human consciousness. Cloning, you can copy new bodies, you can insert them with these devices, and you can have your consciousness reappear. Other great pieces of science fiction, for instance, Soma, which is a wonderful video game. It's a very walking survival horror game, one of my favorite games, deals in human consciousness in this way too. So each of these books proposes a question like that. And the main protagonist of this third book, Aftermath, the reason why I needed to talk about this, comes from the first book, which is Outrage. Outrage, in this one, we're dealing with the idea of self. I think it's a very basic concept, but who are you as a person? And if you're capable of copying yourself, who's the real one? And then the second part is determinism and fate, where were you always going to become a monster? Are you fated to relive the sins of your other copies and stuff like that? And can you break free from cycles and break cycles of violence and, duty and honor and stuff like that? And explores it very well. The main protagonist in that one is a character named Emily Handelman, who's an agent for one of the superpowers, the Panoceanians. And she recruits a team of sort of ne'er-do-wells, and specifically a sniper who's kind of gone out into retirement named Nauf, who is living in a Hawk Islam preserve for these weird alien cats that are being hunted by rich big game hunters. And he comes out of retirement, and they do an op, and it goes bad. And the only survivors are Emily Handelman, Uhahu, who is the protagonist of Aftermath, and Nauf. And it answers that question really well. And I think the final confrontation in that book, where he is basically confronted by a copy of himself that's gone rogue and forced to destroy it, gives a really satisfying sort of like a bit of exposition about the universe you're living in and what the stakes are of like being able to effectively be immortal, what the stakes are of walking away from that, because Nauf cuts out his cube and has for some time, where he doesn't mind if he dies anymore because he doesn't want to be on the treadwheel that he's on of like violence and acting and being bound and owned by somebody. And then the second one is themes of humanity. And what it existentially means to be a human being. It follows the characters Adil Mumit, which is a crane rank officer in the Yuqing State Empire, and another character called Kodali, who is the humanity's first traitor, the first human being who goes over to the Evolved Intelligence, which is like the evil alien coalition. If you want to parallel, think of Halo's Covenant, who are invading the human sphere, and she basically joins them. And the other theme is morality. So it's about humanity and morality, and like whether or not humanity even has like this moral rectitude to fight back, or whether or not they should just succumb, and whether or not this like collectivist EI-driven society is right or wrong. They look like monsters, but are they more human than we are in the way that we treat each other, and the way that we like politic and machine and betray each other and stuff? And so that comes into question. I think that the exploration of that is another solid theme where you focus on these two principal characters. There are supporting cast, but you boil it down to their journey, much like Outrage did with Nauf, where the supporting cast of Nauf, the supporting cast are basically there for Nauf and Emily Handelman to have their sort of duality of one person who is doing things for duty, the other person who's walked away from duty to sort of self-determine, and the conflict that comes from that stuff. And so now we get to Aftermath and Uhahu, who is coming back. Now, Wahu is a secondary protagonist in Outrage in this book right here, which is why I dug it out in particular. And the other of the three survivors of the Dolly Dagger, which is a Jimi Hendrix song that's referenced a lot in this book, which I really like, actually. I put it on while I was reading it again just to like try and envision what the music was that was playing when they're flying the Dolly Dagger around, which I thought was really cool. And she doesn't get a lot of exposition, but you do learn a lot about her background. She is a character from the Black Labs in Tunguska. And she stands out amongst the cast as she looks like a child, but she's not actually a child. She was grown to be an organ farm for rich people, which is a messed up thing that happens in the Nomad State Empire, or the Nomad, not Empire, but the Nomad sort of like society. The Nomad Society itself is three major ships: Tunguska, Corregidor, and then the third one is Bakunin. We end up interacting a lot with Bakunin and Tunguska in this third book. And they basically are always on the move, and think of them as like where international waters are in the human sphere. So all of the bad stuff happens there, but they're also used as like proxies for all these other state empires and hyperpowers to do their dirty business in. So they're very useful from the point of view of like, well, we'll just have the nomads do it, or we'll have the nomads take the fall of it, or we'll support like this proxy war inside the nomad nations, or the nomads are going to be in this territory so we can have them invade. And she lives a terrible life, basically. She's just going to be a body farm. And in fact, she loses her left arm early on as a transplant for the person that she is a clone of. Her body is basically vat grown. And she is genetically locked in childhood. So she's not allowed to grow. So even though she's a grown woman, even in the first book, in Outrage, and Nauf immediately identifies that she is definitely like she's a grown up. She's not a kid, and knew she wasn't a kid just from the look in her eye of like how old she looks. She's perpetually locked in that state. And the idea is that if you keep parts fresh, right, if they're always in like the early stages of development, you can grow them to be the right size if you need them to. You just unlock basically their ability to age, and you rapidly age them to fit. So she's basically just born to be car parts. And when the Black Labs get broken up, she's allowed to self-determine. And that's her story in Aftermath. And the idea here is value and worth. If she was built as a commodity, does she have value and worth? and does her life, and like basically the moral, if that's like the moral question that she's internally struggling with, then its meaning comes after that. Like, what gives her life meaning and how does she self-determine? Which is an interesting proposition. But it's a proposition that started in Outrage and then sort of explored in Aftermath. So you get that as her story, and in fact now screws up the first op where he's facing down his sort of like demons because he saves her. He kills a Drus trooper and saves her instead of keeping his position and fulfilling his mission. And that's a big sort of like hinge point for Outrage. And Aftermath is about her trying to like, it's kind of the Saving Private Ryan moment where she's having her moment with Tom Hanks where he says, like, make this mean something, like be worth this, you know what I mean? Be worth the sacrifice that just happened for you. She's struggling with that in the beginning of Aftermath. And I'll be more spoiler heavy in the first two. I'm trying not to be, I'm going to talk in circles a bit around Aftermath. But the hinge is that she is now not with Emily Handelman. She's by herself. She's on Tunguska, and she is trying to face down her past. She's immersing herself in where she came from to confront it because she's wrestling with that demon of, do I have value and am I worth something? And that seems to be the core proposition of this book. By the end of it, she is faced with sort of like after Act 1, and you kind of meet the cast of where she is and what she's doing. You have a flashback scene where you see her moral quandary, where she's confronted by the legacy of her upbringing, where another Black Lab, like Tunguskan kid, like organ farm, is killed by the organization she's working for, and they treat it like shit, that thing wasn't even human, it was just a commodity. And she is like overwhelmed by that sense of like valuelessness, and it basically aims to screw over her employer. And all of the subsequent sort of like drama and conflict comes from that. And by the end of it, she's given some small resolution where she is basically decides to self-determine and leave the nomad nation behind and go back to living her own life, basically, that she was worth something and she has value, and that she is not her origins, she is her own self-determination, and her life has had value, and that she can add value to somebody else. So how does this book go about achieving that structurally? Well, it does so by basically introducing an enormous cast of characters, only a few of whom are fairly original in this book. I think I clocked at least 7 major Infinity characters just randomly showing up throughout this, some of whom don't even have lines. Like, Valkyrie shows up and has like maybe 1 line. Laxmi shows up and has some exposition just because they kind of require a hacker for hire to chase down Uhahu, and so she's in it briefly. 8-Ball's in it, just in like a news clip. You see 8-Ball from Aristea fighting, although 8-Ball isn't an Infinity character, he's a major Aristea character. You also have Inquisitor Sforza, the bounty hunter, Miranda Ashcroft, the bounty hunter, kind of in the background, and then Reverend Healer Agatha Yubara shows up as well as a major feature of a tertiary character from this story, a tertiary protagonist, and their sort of like plot development as a person, of being loved. And that's a lot. And so if the story is about worth and value, there are several characters who also have that same question posed to them. The team that is sort of like assembled to pull off the heist that Wahu wants to have to ruin her employer, to get revenge, is made up of a Chimera, which is a large, like, genetically altered fighter who's fighting as part of the Aristea team that she's working for. She's kind of working as like a bets manager. She's a bookie for this like this like criminal organization in Tunguska. And his thing is he doesn't want to be a monster anymore. He wants to earn enough credits to get his humanity back, and that he was loved where he came from. And then Connolly, who is the other sort of tertiary like protagonist, is the Caledonian sort of like fist fighter who's also an aristo, and her team that she's managing, she basically convinces a couple of them to betray their employer and come with her and pull off this heist during a game. They have to throw a match so that she can steal all of his money and get away with it. And then the rest of the conflict kind of stems from that. And so once we reach that point where Act 1 is setting that scene, Act 2 is now the conflict that erupts from that happening, and then Act 3 is the resolution of that and how everybody feels about it when it's over. Acts 2 and 3 are full of these additional characters. And so while we get sort of like a very brief one-page description of why each of these other two characters, these tertiary characters that aren't Uhahu, want their humanity back, you find out that Connolly has a child and a wife back on Ariadne, and that there was an orphanage that the other character, oh shit, I've forgotten his name now. His name is, I've completely forgotten it. There's literally like an introduction scene where her boss introduces them all. Ishinomori. Yeah, that's right. Ishinomori is the big like demon looking guy who basically looks like Bowser from Super Mario. He's like a weird demon turtle. He has like a turtle back, and I don't know, man. If you like mixed an Oni with a turtle, you have Ishinomori. So their story is not more than a panel really as to why she manages to flip them against the team. And so their resolutions don't really matter, and they're never the relationship between their story and Uhahu isn't really given a lot of time to develop. Now, as we head into the third act, we've spent basically an inordinate amount of time being chased by other characters from the Infinity Universe. Like I said, Sforza shows up, Miranda Ashcroft shows up. Most of the Aristo team with Valkyrie and Laxmi show up. Like most of the Infinity box set or the Aristo box set at some point shows up in this comic. And the only one that's really given any time to marinate is they attempt to go in hiding on another Nomad ship, and Ishinomori is met with his foster mother, I guess, the orphanage caretaker, which is Reverend Healer Agatha Yubara from the Nomad Empire. On Bakunin, not Kregador. And that is given some, her taking them in and giving them safety when they're on the run gives his story some relevance. And eventually he has his story conclude and Yubara's story sort of conclude about at the end of the second act. And it has some time to actually marinate on in panel or sort of on screen, if you will, and you have some feeling for it. Now, that's a problem, I would say, in that we almost care more about his arc than the protagonists. The second problem is that the third of the tertiary characters, which is Connolly, has no explanation as to why he wants what he wants at all. There is almost no screen time for him, because the panels are being eaten up by combat sequences and like flashes of interaction with all of these sort of like member berry characters where it's like, remember this character, remember that character, and their brief sort of screen time, and the villain having exposition with them as to what the next move maybe are, how they're going to track down and chase these fleeing protagonists. Connolly basically exists in this comic book to be a physical, like, I guess, carrier for Uhahu. Uhahu's lack of ability to like take care of herself physically is being augmented by her two teammates that come with her. And by the end, that's really all he's doing. He's carrying her through combat situations to the end. He's like a physical proxy for her. She's the brain, he's the body. And because of that, we don't really, the get back to my daughter and get back to my wife thing, you never really understand why he wasn't able to provide for them. Like, are they poor? Are they downtrodden? Are they in some kind of situation? Is he paying off a debt? You don't really understand why this guy needs all this money, except for he wants to have money to take care of his daughter and wife. Like, you're given like a bit of like, maybe he's an absentee father. He's under contract to this criminal organization to work as an aristo. But it's all, there's never really any there's even really any way to surmise what it is. It's just dad, far from home, wife and kid back home, money good, then get to go back home. And it makes him feel really thin. So while they're busy sort of fleshing out Uahu's like reactions to things, most of her character development is explained in here. It's not actually explained in Aftermath, and most of what you know about her, you're carrying over from the previous comic. Her guilt at like her team getting killed to save her, like all of the stuff that you know about what's going on in her head comes from previous comics, as she's like the carryover character from Outrage. You don't really get anything extra. With Connolly, you get almost nothing. So like you don't really know what he wants, except that he's just big Infinity Conor McGregor, like punching his way through life, trying to get back to his wife and kid that he left for don't know reasons. And most of that, I would say, is because the cast is too big in this. There's too much member-berry insertion of tertiary characters, of familiar faces from Infinity. And because of that, it feels like it's more of an Avengers Endgame where you get 5 minutes with all of your favorite characters and go, hey, look at them, remember these guys? As opposed to having sort of the space that they had in this one, in the first one, and the space that Adel and Kodali had to become fully formed characters, to have their own journey and their own episodes happen, so they understood what their motivations were. There's not enough time for the relationship between Connolly, Ishinomura, and Uhahu to form and matter. It's just basically purely financial, and so them carrying any kind of personal motivation into the job doesn't happen. There's no first act trauma that like binds them all together. There's no second act moment really that isn't just their own personal baggage from before that carries them through together into the end. And it's just this ticking clock of like Uhahu having to hack something so they can all get paid and get out, that kind of keeps them moving in the same direction until the third act. And that, I think, is the flaw in this book. So does that make it a bad comic? No, absolutely not. There's tons of your favorites. Lots of characters show up from Infinity that I think are fun to read about. The combat sequences are great. The art is great. It's cool to get the exposition that we get about the Krug basically happening between all of the Nomad motherships. And I love that, just like the previous two, they kind of are set in specific places with specific protagonists and antagonists that you understand. Like a character from Outrage shows up again, who's this like, he's a politico inside Yu Ching that is manipulating society sort of like through the people's perception of everything. I enjoy that, and that's great. But from a storytelling point of view, and whether or not it delivers a message on people's value, like if it delivers its core message of like, what is the human person's value? How do we get between point A and point B? Why does Uhahu discover at the end that she has value and that she wasn't just some like soulless creation? We never get that payoff, really. She just says she gets it and she's going to go back to Emily at the end of it all. We don't see the moment that causes her to understand that or feel that the way we do with Nauf and the way we do with Adel and Kodali in the previous two books. And it's purely based on the fact that there's just too much other scene stuff happening to have the pages and panels to make a concise story. These ones are very concise, direct stories that give you a slice of specific characters. Aftermath, I think, tries to fit in too many recognizable faces and then give them some light motivation as to why to be there that we don't really get apart from money. It's just money. It's just money at the end of it all. And I understand that value and worth and having everyone's motivation be money, like that's a writing device for sure. But if the idea is that you need to transcend that and that you're not just commoditizing people, like everybody in here is basically a commodity. Whether they're a mercenary or a bounty hunter, they're all just doing it for the dollar. And there isn't really a clear core message as to how Wahu transcends that when it's all said and done. There's a bit of exposition with the Yu Ching sort of politico at the end, that there's something other else going on in the background with her little character named Gibson, her little like shoulder puppet base AI. But it's not satisfying in any way. And it doesn't do anything other than just create another commodity. Like here's another commodity we were trying to farm at the same time. So her transcending that when it's all said and done, and the sort of happy endings that go to Yubara, spoiler alert, to Connolly and to her, don't have any sense of like, well, why did she end up seeing her own value? Like, if we're putting this in like Wizard of Oz points of view, what's the moment that the Scarecrow realizes he has a brain? What's the moment that the Lion understands he has courage? What's the moment that the Tin Man realizes he has a heart? There has to be an inciting incident to allow them to transcend their one singular belief that they're a thing versus to the new belief system that they hold after that sort of like moment of transmogrification. And Aftermath doesn't really give us that for Oahu. So is it satisfying from like a lore point of view? Yep, absolutely. Is it a cool dive into the universe? Absolutely. Is it as well written as Outrage and Betrayal are from the point of view of telling a really cool, concise story with a central theme? It isn't, unfortunately. And I think it's because of that like Avengers Endgame fitting in all of these familiar faces and having them all have a little bit more screen time. That screen time is borrowed from being able to develop the character relationships and give it a central plot and a central theme that has a great payoff at the end. So if I was to rank these, I'd still give Outrage like a 5 out of 5. I think that its central themes are wonderful. It's really well drawn, really well written. I'd give the Betrayal probably like a 4.5, and this one's probably a 3.5 as far as like my judgment criteria, which is what is if you're doing a graphic novel, there needs to be a concise story and a point and a theme, and not just have it be kind of an exposition dump about the universe with some familiar faces and like a very big cast. I think smaller cast is better. Tell me a concise story from inside the universe, and allow the exposition to be natural as opposed to being a bit more forced. And I think it would be a better overall comic book, story in general. So there it is. That's my GMG review of Aftermath by Corvus Belli. I haven't done something like this in a while. I mean, this is obviously like a writing thing, and I love writing, and I love the nuts and bolts of writing and how the sausage is made of writing. So I really enjoy doing this, and I'm excited to do more of this. I'm actually thinking about doing a book club, a GMG book club with the patrons, which I think would be super fun. So tell me what you think. Doing like a book club, doing like a readers thing where we break down story beats and plots and why does something work and why does something not work would be a very fun thing to do. It's been on my list of things to do for a while, and I think doing this, thanks Corvus Belli for kickstarting this in me again, because I will take a rainy day read of a couple of books and actually break down like the plot structure and stuff any day. This is super fun for me, and I hope it was fun for you guys to listen to. So I hope this didn't spoil anything for anybody who was looking forward to reading this in the future, but I gave you lots of warning. There's too much warning at the beginning, and I look forward to doing my next one of these. I'm Ash, Network Gaming. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed that video, and thank you for watching. If you want to find out more about me and see what I'm up to, you can check me out on Facebook at facebook.com/outofthebasement-into-the-streets or Instagram at Guerrilla Miniature Games. You can also find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Guerrilla Miniature Games, and of course, you can now follow on Patreon if you don't want to back and see what's new. Thanks for watching.